Bleak Fate Forsaken is possibly the most ambitious indie game of 2023.
Very ambitious.
With the development team of only 3 people, it's really impressive that this thing even works without breaking your PC every couple of minutes. You know. Oh, it's not like more expensive games would ever do that, right? To be honest, the size of the studio doesn't mean that much in the grand scheme of things. The majority of people just want to play a good game, without concerning themselves how many people created it, but nevertheless, I think it's worth mentioning. I invested a decent amount of hours into Bleak Fate, so now it's finally the time to talk about all the positive and the negative stuff about the game. Let's start with the visuals and the setting first. We've seen a ton of Souls-like RPGs over the years, but
I have to give it to them, the visuals in this setting are great. I like them a lot.
I can say without a doubt that none of them had a similar artistic
and whenever I say visuals, I don't mean the fidelity, I just mean the style. I think the style is interesting and unique.
Style and the setting. The unique artistic style that's seamlessly mixing medieval and some light sci-fi / cyberpunk elements, I guess, helps Bleak Fate to distinguish itself from similar games in this subgenre. Souls-like games and the majority of action RPGs in general mostly stick to somewhat generic medieval themes. I personally couldn't care less because I love medieval settings in general, but it feels refreshing to see something new that actually looks good and it doesn't feel out of place. This is an Unreal Engine 4 game, so the fidelity of the visuals is not amazing by any means. You'll stumble upon some muddy textures and low-resolution assets here and there, but for the most part, the game looks decent.
The graphics for the game were not really a problem. I do think the lighting, like for example, having a really large, like that big NPC that I was supposed to fight, you can easily say, oh, well, you should have just skipped the NPC. Well, then why put him there if you just want people to skip him? Like, it doesn't really make sense, because he's not, like, really guarding anything. It doesn't make sense. Like, what... Because I get, like, for example, like, the Asylum Demon at the beginning. Well, you're supposed to skip him and then go get the weapon and kill him, right? But, like, it's kind of obvious that's the case. And I don't... And then also, you don't have to fight him like under the shade of like multiple trees at like 4 different levels of elevation that he randomly moves to while you're hitting his feet and slowly damaging him. Like, yeah, in the dark, it's just
the gray / brownish color palette definitely won't be everyone's cup of tea, but without it, the creative vision of this art style just wouldn't work. I personally love vibrant colors in my art.
I think that the art style, it probably gets old after a while. Seeing the same stuff over and over. I think like kind of having a very limited color palette is something that limits a game. Like for example, even in Bloodborne, I feel like that's probably one of the larger negatives to the game, is that the game doesn't really have a lot of different vibrant environments. It just has like kind of gray, black, and then different shades of gray. And that's about it.
RPGs. So this is not exactly my favorite look. The last time I mentioned that I love...
Yeah, this is like Cyberpunk Bloodborne, but everything's broken. You wish it was only 30 FPS.
Vibrant color palettes in games. Someone in the comments said that I sound like a putty. Well, fuck you too, bitch. Anyway, the most impressive thing about the visuals is the architecture of this world and some breathtaking landscapes. If you don't look up from time to time, you can easily miss the most visually impressive parts of this game.
I think the visuals for the game are probably the best part of the game.
Draw distance is pretty good, and if you look closely, you can see something interesting in the distance. Whether that's a shiny item or a mysterious NPC that's waiting to be killed.
Yeah.
That might seem like a small...
And I think like it seems very obvious to me that this game was inspired a lot by Dark Souls 1 and like the interconnected level design of the game. I think they took a decently good shot at it. There are a number of things that I think that are just like bad. But like, I mean, I'm sure he'll get into them and I'll comment on them at that time. But yeah, it's a decent
but it's
attempt.
a huge plus in my book, because it should incentivize the player to explore the map. Then again, there are a lot of blurry textures in the distance on
Incentivizing the player to explore the map, I think the problem is that because the game has like such bad fidelity, it's very difficult to tell, is this actually part of the map or did I go out of bounds? Because there were tons of times I went out of bounds in the map and I'm just running around randomly and I don't know, am I looking for something? Is there some rare item here? It's like, for example, like whenever you would play Halo 2 or Halo 3 or Halo 1 and you would get out of bounds, right? You'd do a super jump, you'd be able to like use a rocket jump on your friend's head, and then they jump you up on there, and you can, run over like the Cairo map or something like that. It's very obvious that you're doing something that you're not supposed to do because the visuals are totally different. It doesn't look that way. Like you can see all the mobs down there. It's very defined. But with this game, I never knew, like, what am I doing? Where am I going? There's no map in the game. And I think that not having a map in the game is not a big deal. Like, Dark Souls doesn't have a map either. But it becomes a big deal whenever you have the same mobs in the same areas and everything looks the exact same with the same colors everywhere.
some assets, which can sometimes ruin the mood a little bit, but that probably had to be done because of the optimization. The majority of the skybox is dominated by the architecture of the game.
Yeah, that's fine.
The world itself is described
Skybox
as an
is fine.
omni-structure, so this kinda makes sense from the lore perspective as well. By the way, the performance of the game is pretty good, at least when it comes to my, by all means, pretty average PC for this day and age. I even managed to run the game on 4K with medium settings and I got around 40 to 60 FPS, so some of the footage you'll see is in 4K.
I mean, like, the FPS is garbage because you have to lock it at a certain amount or it just fucks up the game. So, I mean, like, multiple people have announced that and said that's a problem.
I had 0 crashes while playing the game, which is also worth mentioning. The lighting in the game...
I had no crashes while playing the game, but I also had, like, super bad choppiness. And, like, I had to restart the game a number of times. Like, probably 4 or 5 times I had to restart the game.
It's pretty basic and it seems static for the most part. Some of the zones you'll get to visit are pretty dark and they require you to use an item like a torch or a simple potion for emitting light, but it's not a huge deal. Speaking of different zones, the visual variety is pretty decent in Bleak Fate. All of the zones you'll get to explore have something unique going on.
I think this is the best part of the game here that I've at least experienced, is the part where you can go actually into the water and get eaten by the serpent. I think that's really cool, and it's probably the best visual area in the game that I've seen.
When it comes to the visuals, they all try to portray a desperate and gloomy atmosphere. And they do it with great success, but like I said, this visual style won't be everyone's cup of tea. The last thing I want to mention about the art style is the unique enemy design. There are some interesting looking creatures you'll get to see, to say the least. Not only to see, but fight as well. The worst part about the visuals is the UI design, which looks like it's still in pre-alpha version.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Seriously, if this game does well, I think the first thing they should do is to hire someone to completely redesign the user interface.
I definitely agree with that.
It's not a huge deal, it's completely functional, and some parts of it are decent, but for the most part...
The UI is not even in the top 5 biggest problems of this game.
It looks very basic and unfinished. Now look, none of this shit matters if the gameplay is not good, so let's start talking about it.
Okay.
Bleak Fate is not...
I mean, I think that, like, this is a little bit of a distorted visual of what it looks like, because this boss basically, like, I'm assuming he's like every single other boss that's built like this. It seems that you hit their legs, and then after you hit their legs, you get on top of them, and then you spam one button until an arbitrary period of time passes that you can't know except for by failing at it, and then you have to jump down and repeat the process. Like, I mean, this is, it's just garbage. It is. Like, I'm sorry, it's fucking garbage. Like, it might look cool, and I do think that, yeah, some of the combat is cool, but a lot of it isn't.
Bleak Fate is not wasting your time with long, unnecessary tutorials. You get a simple cutscene that has some vague story details and you jump right in. While the game does have a couple of tips here and there, you need to discover how everything works by yourself. Right after you start the game, you'll get the feel of the action combat system. Bleak Fate's combat has a combo system, and if you don't learn how it actually works, it can feel unresponsive and a bit clunky. I had some troubles in the beginning of the game with the combo system because I'm so used to pressing the attack button at the end of the attack animation. Probably because the majority of action RPGs make you press the attack button like that in order to execute a good combo. However, Bleak Fate took the opposite approach because if you try to wait for the attack animation to end, you'll possibly interrupt the combo or spend a lot more stamina for the next attack. When you actually...
I think this just makes the game worse. Like, I understand there's a lot of times whenever people try to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes there's a reason why we have a wheel.
Try to learn how it works, it's very hard to miss a combo, no matter which weapon you decide to use. As soon as you press the attack button, you can cue the next attack, and you can do it indefinitely, as long as you have the stamina.
I mean, I don't see, like, how that's good. Like, so it's just a different type of spamming? I mean, okay, like, that's...
The little icons in the corner of the screen are there to show you a successful combo. Some of the perks you can get for a character will be related to the combo system, and the damage you deal is also affected.
Yeah, there's a couple of them.
But the most important thing about the combo system is how much stamina you manage to save. The game is really generous with the amount of attacks you can chain together when you successfully do a combo.
Yeah, it is.
I was using a great sword and some very heavy weapons for the most of my playthrough, and I think it's even easier to perform successful combos with these weapons. You have more than enough time to cue the next attack or cancel the attack animation
let's watch and
if you
see
think
how,
you're getting
okay,
hit.
cut.
Yeah, you can cancel pretty much every action you perform in the game, which gives you a very good sense of control over your character. You can cancel actions by dashing, or you can even try to time the parry in the middle of the attack.
Well, and the dash, like, for example, the only way you can dash is by pressing the spacebar twice. Like, I don't like that. I wish, and there's no way to change it. I think that, like, as a setting, it's fine, but that's the only thing that you can't rebind this. You can't, like, so basically the dodge is awkwardly fast. Yes, it's extremely fast, and it's extremely fast in a game that has slower pacing than Dark Souls 1. It's because you're keybind? Well, I mean, like, it's not, though. So that's not true.
If you think the enemy will manage to hit you before you hit them, it looks something like this. On the other side, the game doesn't have any iframes, even though you can dash and dodge. At first, I thought I'm going to have a much bigger problem with this design decision. First of all, it's a ballsy decision to say the least, because in order for combat to work properly with zero iframes, the hitboxes need to be very good. There are definitely some examples where I felt like the hitboxes were a bit unfair, but for the most part, I didn't have any where I felt like the hitboxes were a bit unfair, but for the most part, I didn't have any bigger issues when avoiding attacks.
I think, again, like, this is another example of what I was saying, where it's like, there's a reason why a lot of games have iframes.
with dashes and dodges. I didn't use the lock-on button at all, so if you were wondering, it's entirely possible to play the game like this, but I guess the majority of people will try to use it.
Yeah, of course.
It's not hard to land hits on target without a lock-on, which makes me happy. I always prefer a soft lock-on or freeform type of combat, rather than using this scrappy mechanic that haven't changed for decades. It's not just about Bleak Fate, I'm talking about the lock-on in general, it just annoys the shit out of me. This fucking mechanic haven't changed since Zelda Ocarina of Time. Anyway, as for the general feel of the combat...
I think that lock-on is totally fine, but he's totally right with mobs like the Amygdala or the, Black Blade Kindred or the Magma Worm, that lock-ons with enemies whose heads loom over you and it moves your camera around a lot, it's really bad. And I do think that they should fix that.
But my biggest concern was always the sense of impact on hits and proper animations. Most smaller studios are usually struggling with those features.
Yeah.
However, I think there is nothing wrong with attack animations in Bleak Fates. Quite the contrary, I love the attack pattern for my greatsword, and the game has a very decent sense of impact.
I mean, I don't know, that's a bit much. Like, maybe it's just me, that's a lot. Okay.
But it wasn't always like that. I remember that the first demo for the game was highly criticized for the lack of impact on hits. So I'm really glad they took that as a feedback and improved that as much as possible. Is it the most impactful action combat out there like Elden Ring, Monster Hunter or Dragon's Dogma? No, but I would still say it feels pretty decent regardless, even when it comes to most basic weapon attacks. The controls for the game were pretty solid.
That's fine.
Even in the prototype version from 2019, which I got to play back then. Mouse and keyboard controls are surprisingly good actually. I usually prefer a controller for games of this type just because I like to sit back and relax, but mouse and keyboard controls are very good in this game. That's why I just decided to continue playing with mouse and keyboard until the very end. I had
Yeah, I mean, like, you can't even play with the controller, so it's like it's hard to really compare, like, what it would be like. I don't know.
Plans to switch to my PS5 controller as soon as I'm done with setting up the game for recording, but I didn't. Come to think of it, it's quite possibly the best mouse and keyboard controls that I experienced in a Souls-like game, including...
I think Elden Ring controls are way better, and so is Dark Souls 3.
The original Souls games, but my memory might be a bit clouded when it comes to this, so don't quote me on that. I played Elden Ring on my PS5, so I don't know. I always try to keep the control discussion at bare minimum, because I'm pretty sure I can play any game with a steering wheel if that was the only option. I'm not trying to brag or anything, and I'm nowhere near as good as crazy people with the dance pad, but I get used to the control schemes very fast. Overall, I think the controls are snappy, although the character movement can feel a bit floaty sometimes and jumping could feel a bit better, especially in some platforming sections.
Yeah, for sure.
What really took me by surprise is the dismemberment system, which really helps with the sense of impact.
I don't feel like it did. I feel like it was just like randomly there was a leg in front of me. Like, I don't know, like, to me it just, yeah, it felt like there was like a leg, like an arm, it's just popped off in front of me, like, wait, what? I didn't even do that. That was cool.
All weapons have a chance to cut off limbs of enemies, but this also depends on the weight of the weapon. That was good news for me, because this greatsword is really heavy, so I'm cutting off limbs almost every time in a fight. Decapitations and cutting enemies in half are one of the most enjoyable moments you can have in combat.
Okay.
There is a reason why dismemberment mods are so famous for a lot of games, like Mountain Blade and Skyrim for example. People love chopping off limbs, but I guess game developers are a bit hesitant to include this feature, probably because they want to keep that ESRB or PEGI rating under control to reach wider audience. The last Souls-like game I played that allowed you to cut off limbs of enemies was The Surge 2, but cutting off limbs in that game felt a bit systematic and scripted. It seems like Bleak Fate takes in consideration your stats, enemies' health, and, like I said, the weight of the weapon.
I don't see how that cut off his arm though.
Your
Like, how did that cut off his arm? I mean,
your stats, enemies' health, and, like I said, the weight of the weapon. Even some bigger enemies are not immune to this. Putting that aside, the weapon and armor you're using is extremely important in the game. I mean, sure, you can try to beat the whole game with the first pipe you get in the beginning, and it's possible I guess, but it's not really recommended. Anyway, some fights in the game will not only depend on your skill as a player, but your stats as well. Bigger enemies and some bosses require you to jump on their back and stab them a couple of times.
like, I'm sorry, but like, this is just... Like, who thought this was a good idea? I mean, I don't really understand that. Like, what is this? The mechanic is... Yeah, I feel like that mechanic was horrible. There's not a single time I enjoyed using it.
But before that, you usually have to damage their legs, and when they fall down, you have to jump on their back.
Yeah.
This reminds me a bit of Dragon's Dogma, but it's not exactly so dynamic. In Dragon's Dogma, you could climb on monsters whenever you want, as long as you have the stamina. Bleak Fate took a more systematic approach, where some monsters will have a couple of specific points on their back that you have to damage. Enemies will try to shake you off, and if your stats are not that great, they can even kill you in one hit in this position. The damage you deal on their back also depends on your character stats. I noticed I do far greater damage on their back once I got some better gear. I like this mechanic for what it is, but it's also my biggest problem with some boss fights, because it can feel very gimmicky. And that was very disappointing for me, even though the presentation of that particular boss fight was great. I won't show you the footage because I don't want to spoil the fights. Speaking of bosses, those you actually get to fight normally are pretty good. They have decent amount of different mechanics they can use, and the difficulty will depend on your character's stat.
I think this boss was, like, the only mechanic I didn't like was whenever he just spin around, like, 6 times. Like, that's, yeah, I thought that was shitty. But other than that, I feel like the rest of it was, like, kind of okay.
Different mechanics they can use, and the difficulty will depend on your character's stats and your skill, of course. The difficulty of these fights is not extremely hard, but they are hard enough to make you feel good when you kill them, if that makes sense. If I would have to compare the boss difficulty to Souls games, I would say they are slightly harder than most boss fights in Dark Souls 1.
I feel like whenever I beat that boss, like, most of the difficulty I felt with that boss was the clunkiness of the game. So, like, moving in and out for combat, being able to move close enough to him to actually hit him with the short-range weapon that I was given, being able to move away from him whenever the spin he does happens and it's, like, not super laggy. Like, that's... those were the... Like, that was where the difficulty was, not the mechanics.
But definitely not as hard as some boss fights in Dark Souls 3. But of course, your experience could be a lot different than mine. That being said, I feel like the game could use a couple of more bosses in general. Bleak Fate has secret areas and optional boss fights as well, which can provide you with some very useful items. When you kill certain bosses, you will start seeing new NPCs being spawned in old areas, which is pretty cool. This gives you something new to kill and possibly something new to loot. And fights with these new NPCs are noticeably harder. One of the best weapons in the game can be looted like this, by the way. Speaking of items, I mentioned the character stats multiple times, so let's finally talk about the progression.
Okay.
I was very skeptical about this at first, but after I beat the game, I think the character progression is one of the best things about Bleak Fates. The reason why I was skeptical is the lack of a leveling system. Even though Bleak Fate has a very long list of character stats that you would expect to find in a proper RPG, they are not related to character levels. There are no souls, runes, or any currency that you would pick up when you kill enemies. Instead, your stats are only affected by the items you equip on your character. That raises some concerns about the balancing, but Bleak Fate tries to prevent you from just getting the best gear in the game and killing everything in one hit. Each weapon and armor piece have different tiers of quality, 5 to be more precise. Enemies will never drop an item with MK level 5, you will have to upgrade these items by yourself. Some items have obviously stronger base stats, so even without upgrading them, your character will get noticeably stronger. But you can only unlock the full potential of the weapon or the armor piece by visiting the hub area and upgrading the items. You can't exactly get your item to MK level 5 right away, even if you have the materials. You'll need to push the story forward. And I'm using the word story very loosely here, it's more like an event that you have to trigger. The game is very light on the story, like I said before. So yeah, there are some...
I don't think that the story being like kind of irrelevant, like not knowing anything about it, I don't really think that matters. Like most people that play Dark Souls don't know anything about the story, and that's fine. So that wasn't really a big deal for me.
Systems which should prevent you from just cheesing or breaking the progression. But let's be honest, you can break almost every single player game if you really want to, so I have no doubts in my mind that someone could find a way. I think this system works pretty well, but what's even more important is how fun are the weapons that you can use. There are a lot of weapons in the game and some of them share the same movesets, and only a couple of them share the same abilities. I tested a lot of weapons I found, but I played the majority of the game with a greatsword and a bow. You can choose to ignore the weapon abilities if you wish to, but I would definitely recommend using them. Some of them can apply a debuff to enemies' armor, which increases your regular damage a lot, so it's not just about a single full attack, even though a lot of these abilities are exactly that. There are some crazy looking abilities, and all of them pack quite a punch. Some weapons will give you passive abilities as well, which can be even more useful for your desirable playstyle. All of these abilities use flux as a resource, which is essentially just a mana bar. And if you want to focus your playstyle around these abilities, you will need to improve that stat with specific gear pieces you can find.
Yeah, I could see that being more interesting, like kind of the Ashes of War. I mean, at the point that I was at, I didn't really have a weapon that could do that, and the one that I did have that could do that got replaced, so that didn't really happen.
Overall, I think there are more than enough weapons with different movesets to shape your playstyle. Definitely a lot more than expected. The range gameplay felt satisfying as well, especially because the headshots, which deal considerably more damage.
Yeah, I think that was a good thing.
For example, this bow has very cool and useful abilities. But this one has passive abilities for increasing the draw speed, which feels amazing to use. It all comes down to what you prefer, because it seems like most weapons are viable in fights as long as you keep improving them. Some of the
I don't know why they wanted you to only have 5 arrows though. I feel like why is that? Like, how is that good? I don't know. I think that was like really annoying, because like I had to constantly focus on like every arrow that I was making, like make new arrows. Like, what the fuck? Why not just let people shoot as many arrows as they make? You can cycle through them when you get more. But what? Well, then what? Then why make it really bad at the beginning then?
Ranged weapons like staves can be used in melee as well, which is a pretty cool feature. Same goes for ranged enemies. They will switch to melee if you get close. They will try to kite you and keep their distance for a bit. Speaking of that, I think the AI is quite solid. Stronger enemies will try to use the parry mechanic, dodge and heal themselves. They will even try to avoid ranged attacks, which can be annoying sometimes, but it prevents you from just headshotting everyone. Friendly fire is a thing in this game, so you can use that to your advantage in group fights. Overall, I think Bleak Fate has a really nice gameplay loop, which allows you to switch builds on the fly by just changing the gear. And even the process of looting feels very good, because you can't loot duplicates. That essentially makes looting always exciting because you know you're getting a brand new item. At least when it comes to new armor pieces and weapons.
If it drops, but yeah.
There are a bunch of lootable items in general, which are usually used for crafting. The crafting itself is very basic and straightforward, but kinda essential. You will need to craft potions for healing and flux, and possibly arrows if you use the bow. There are a bunch of recipes for consumables that you can find.
Yeah, I think that the crafting and the consumable thing, like, that's kind of fine, I would say. The only thing I didn't like is how few arrows you could have on you at the beginning of the game. It just, especially whenever you combine that with, like, how infrequent there are checkpoints, it just really didn't really make sense.
The game and craft very powerful potions. I usually ignore these parts in games unless I hit a brick wall and I really need a boost, but you can go crazy with potions. You can do all of this in the menu if you have the materials. On top of all of that, Bleak Fate has another layer of progression in terms of perks. When you kill a boss, you get a perk point that you can use at the next checkpoint. There is a generous amount of perk points to choose because each one of these perks have at least a couple of different upgrade paths. You can have up to 4 perks at once, and most of them are really powerful, so this seems okay. The perks are interesting enough and definitely useful, but I think weapons and abilities are way more important. And the last but not least, we have a couple of permanent abilities that you can find. You get 8 of them in the beginning, but you can find a lot more and use only 2 of them at once. I focused a lot more on weapon abilities, but these permanent abilities can be useful as well. Bleak Fate is definitely a little bit rough around the edges, but I don't think it has any serious problems when it comes to combat. Although you can see even greater potential of this combat system if the...
I don't know. I mean, like, if I look at that, yeah, I don't think so. Like, for example...
when it comes to combat.
Like, not being able to see what's going on half the time, getting hit by mobs that are behind you. Let's see... I think that the large NPC combat is just bad. Yeah, I don't know.
Although you can see even greater potential of this combat system if they had more manpower and bigger budgets. But even in this current state, it's more than enough for us.
Now, I do think, like, really, if this game... Like, I will stand by what I said, is that obviously I didn't have a good experience playing this game. But I do think that if they got investment and they actually tried to fine-tune and improve this game, it would be improved by a considerable margin. And it could be a good game. At a certain point, I do actually think so. Like, they have a lot of the things that are, like, intangible, right? And they have a lot of the things that are just kind of, like, rudimentary. Or not rudimentary, but, like, fundamental wrong. Like gameplay type stuff. Like, well, like the getting on top of the giants and, like, fighting them that way. Like, there's no reason that it has to work that way. That's, like, easily fixable.
Solid playthrough or 2. It takes a while to get used to the combo system, at least that was the case with me. And I would like to see some more boss fights, like I said before. Other than that, I think the game has more than generous amount of different weapons that can shape your playstyle, and the second line of progression in terms of perks and abilities is pretty solid. The longevity of this game will definitely depend on future updates, and I believe that one of the developers said on Discord something about new game plus, new enemies and boss fights, etc, etc.
I think they need to figure out and fix, like, the fundamentals of the game first. Fix the movement, polish it up in the next year or so, people enjoy it a lot more. Yeah, I think so. That's really the problem, is that, like, for example, whenever I got on top of some guy and then it blew up on me and there was no indicator that it was going to blow up, and then I just get teleported up in the air and I die. Okay, like, this is stupid. Like, there's, like, what did I do wrong?
Even mentioned roguelike elements for New Game Plus, which sounds pretty cool. And if we can believe them, they promise to keep updating the game quite regularly.
No, hopefully
The
it'll
level
get
design
better.
in Bleak Fate is quite possibly the best feature in the game. I mentioned in my preview video that it reminds me of Dark Souls 1,
Yeah.
and I still stand by that.
Yeah, that's what I said too.
The first area is a very good indicator of what you can expect from the level design in the game. It's highly interconnected, it has multiple paths which lead to different zones, or they just bring you to the other side of the same map where you can unlock a shortcut.
Yeah.
The maps have great verticality, and this kind of level design just wouldn't be possible without it. The exploration is very fun, and once you figure out the layout of the map, it feels pretty good. You can easily miss some optional areas and paths, which I actually like. As for
I
the
would like that more if the game was polished better and there weren't a bunch of ways to get out of bounds in the game that bait you into thinking that you're going into a area that's like hidden. Like, I think that's really cool too, and at the beginning of the game, I actually thought that was awesome. But then as I played more of it and I saw that a lot of these areas that you can get into and like paths that you can take are just inadequacies of the development of the game, or just like, you know, like effectively like rough edges they never sanded off, then I kind of stopped giving a shit about it.
more open areas in the game, they are decent but not so good like more condensed areas I mentioned. However, they are a nice change of pace and they break the monotony of the level design a bit. Like I said before, the looting feels very satisfying, and combined with the great level design, it makes the exploration very good in general. There is not a lot to talk about the story, and even if I try, I will probably spoil the whole thing. But there is not a lot to spoil, since the story just leaves a couple of breadcrumbs here and there, and some cutscenes of course. To be honest with you, I just didn't pay that much attention to it, and this is not exactly my preferred way of storytelling in games. I started a second playthrough, and I'll try to make a bigger effort of understanding what the fuck is going on. The text in the beginning is the only straightforward part about the story that you're going to get. Which reminds me, you gotta love the people who pretend to understand the story in similar games without watching a bunch of YouTube videos about it. Yeah, sure buddy, I believe ya.
This might bother people. People who believe there's a story, which is the equivalent of finding a bunch of random notes and thinking to yourself, damn, that book was wild. Halo's plot is crazy. Have you not read all the secret terminals?
The sound design was one of my main concerns for the game back in the day when I tried those demos.
I actually don't mind the Dark Souls storytelling. I like it, the fact that the story is optional. I like that about this game too. I don't give a fuck about the story, I just want to kill the bosses, I want to do the game.
But the release version of the game fixed a lot of issues I had with this before. I'm really happy to say that sound effects for weapon attacks and abilities pack quite a punch. The sound effects outside of combat could be better though. It's a minor thing I guess, and this is one of those examples
I
where
had a lot of problems with the sound effects where like they would just get turned off randomly. I don't know really why that happened.
see the lack of budget I guess. On the other side, the soundtrack is pretty damn good and very unique actually. It blends so well.
I think that the soundtrack is great, but it's too repetitive. That's the problem.
With this unique environment. Boss fights have their own unique soundtracks as well. The voice acting is average at best, but like I said, there are only a handful of NPCs in the game, so it doesn't matter that much.
Things have been set in motion that can never be explained. Remember to trust your blade. You will need it more than ever.
To sum up this review,
That's one way to write off the lore. Well, they can't be explained. I mean, the game literally tells you you can't explain the lore. It doesn't make any sense.
I obviously enjoyed my
problem
time
solved.
with Bleak Fate. I would recommend checking this game out, especially if you're a fan of Souls-like games. Just don't expect it to be Elden Ring 2. It's a lower budget game that's a bit rough around the edges, but the gameplay is pretty fun, which is the most important thing. I would rank this game much higher than many other Souls-like games I played in the past. And that will be all for this review. Tell me your opinion about Bleak Fate in the comments below. Do you agree with me or not, and do you plan to buy this game? Don't forget to like the video, and subscribing to the channel will mean a lot. If you want to go a step further, you can always support the channel on Patreon or as a YouTube member. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.
Alright. I'm glad at least some people are liking the game. For me, shit, give me a second. For me, I just, bro, I was so frustrated about it. It was awful. And if I had to rate the game, I would probably rate it a 2 or a 3. From the experience that I had playing it, I just felt like it was a, it was just a shit game. Like, that's all there is to it. No shot, Wulong is better. I think Wulong is substantially better than this game. Like, a lot better. It's not even close. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably like a 2 or a 3. 2 or 3 out of 100. Yeah, no, a million.
A triple, what made it triple.